Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Lorimer, today joined by Chris Hattingh. Let's get into the first news story of today, and this was an article that caught my eye right off the bat, and it was Black Mine Boss Rips into Montashe's Contaminated Pen. And this is a story coming from a entrepreneur in Northwest, a mine owner called Joel Mafenya, who made some very directed criticisms of government over its economic policy, particularly towards mining. What was quite interesting to me about this was how he very directly attacked the program of black industrialists that government has been pursuing very aggressively over the past couple of years. Joel Mafenya recently had a court battle against the government over what the government claimed was deficiencies in his social and labor plan, and therefore they wanted to take away his mining license. He managed to win, I believe, in the Northwest High Court on this issue. And he's clearly very upset about being taken to court at all. He described it as a naked example of how the ANC has killed this country by collapsing the economy. And during the worst years, when the Guptas were stealing everything, Montashe was chair of that party. There's still a dark cloud hanging over him. Joel Mafenya went on to say that the ANC pays lip service of creating opportunities for black industrialists, but in fact it has asphyxiated black entrepreneurs who have tried to make their own way. He also hit back at some of government's regulations which require mines to produce sort of social development in the communities around them. He said, quote, "It is so ironic that one reason he gave for cancelling the license is that I haven't built enough houses for the community, but surely it's the job of government to build houses." Again, they're blaming business for their failure. And I think this is a great point to zoom in on, is that, Chris, many defenders of government's economic policy say that this is necessary for redress, that the strict controls, the big regulations, black economic empowerment, black industrialist programs, all these things are necessary to create inclusive growth, as the president likes to term it. But the reality is that these are policies that hurt everyone because they pick winners and losers, and almost every time decisions are made on political grounds, not on what makes the most economic sense. And the people who suffer are those who are left without unemployment, without the opportunity to pay into the fiscus as taxpayers, and communities who are deprived of breadwinners. What's your take on this story?
Yeah, so this is unfortunately one of many examples in South Africa in the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years that points to the issue of wanting to measure policies and legislation by their intentions, however quote unquote noble, and not by their consequences. So, I mean, all of the items you listed, the programs, the legislation, the funds, all of that sort of thing, with the ostensible goal of creating economic growth, especially for those who are excluded by previous governments, but resulting in just a very concentrated economy, certain sectors being favored, and then certain very big players in those sectors. So the ideas or the notions of clientelism and picking winners and losers really jumps to the fore here, where it's one thing to say you want to implement these ideas to increase economic growth, but at the end of the day, only those with the necessary political connections can get those contracts, can get the benefits from that. We see this playing out in our trade policy space, where you've got the localization master plans, where either through subsidies for so-called winners or certain sectors or certain products, they get the subsidies, or the government hikes tariffs on imports to protect those particular select few, the sort of holy few, as it were. At the end of the day, that produces the situation where you've got a 40% unemployment rate, very high youth unemployment rate, and in many ways rising social tension, because citizens are also sold or told economic growth will come. They just need to push for these ideas harder and implement them even more. But it really is a vicious cycle. And of course, to mention maybe lastly, it's not just from the government side, but also for vested interests in terms of business. They benefit when it is a more concentrated economy, when it is more zero sum, because they're in the room when the policies are decided upon. So they get then to dictate what the barriers to entry are once they're in the room. And that means they're protected in the long run.
Exactly. I mean, the government often talks about, particularly since the election, of creating inclusive growth. Well, government policy in so many of these areas is producing quite literally the opposite of inclusive growth. It's enriching those who are already ahead in sectors well established or those who are politically connected. And that's exactly why government needs to begin aggressively rethinking a lot of these policies, and why citizens should demand more from their government. All right, let's go on to political developments around the country. And the first one we're going to talk about here is an interesting by-election in KZN. This by-election was held after the councillor, who was an ANC councillor, passed away. And what was very interesting about this election was that on the provincial ballot in 2024, whilst this had previously been a ward that the ANC won relatively comfortably, the MK party won 54% of the votes cast in this ward on the provincial ballot. So they were the favourites to win the by-election. They had managed to get a majority of the ward to vote for them only last year. Well, it turns out that that wasn't the final result here. In fact, the IFP managed to capture the ward, narrowly beating out the ANC, with the MK party actually finishing in third place. Chris, you can always draw far too many conclusions from a single by-election. They're often driven by a lot of internal dynamics. They're often driven by local organization and candidate recruitment. There's a lot of things going on in these. But this does seem like a warning bell for MK. This should have been a victory for MK. And yet this follows a pattern we've seen over so much of the country, which is that even in places where MK did very well in the last election, they struggled to break through. I think MK has only won, 2 by-elections in the whole country. And one of them wasn't actually even in KZN. I think one of them was in Northwest Province. So, I guess the question here is, does MK have the staying power into the next local government election?
Yeah, so one data point in isolation isn't particularly useful for really understanding anything. But when you see, that's what we'll say before an upcoming election. So you say, don't just look at one by-election, don't look at one poll, look at trends over time, look at it over long time series, take it into the context that society changes as well. But here we're starting to see more and more data points of the troubles that are afflicting MK from an operational point of view, a financing point of view, maybe a focus point of view, riding the wave and not to undermine the achievement of being the third biggest party after last year's elections in the country. But to make that impact is one thing, and then to actually build and run an organization for many years and contest many national, provincial, and local elections takes a lot of focus and a lot of work. So that mostly will fall to someone like Floyd Javambu, who of course moved from the EFF to set up the necessary operations. But here again is another data point where you've seen the fallout between him and Duduzile Zuma, for example, in the last week, where in her apology, quote unquote apology, she mentions everyone in MK in the leadership except the person who she apparently allegedly offended. So you're seeing top down lots of issues for the party. I'm not going to say they won't be able to deal with those, but I don't know if I'm seeing the necessary focus. And on top of that, you've got a collection of individuals who, with very strong personalities and very questionable backgrounds and morals, what keeps them together? What keeps it going together for the good of MK versus for their own vested interests, whatever piece of the empire they want to carve up? Should something happen to former President Zuma, what replaces him in that power vacuum? I'm sure that's for many of those involved in leadership part of their calculations, and that undercuts the work that they would then do for the party, for the good of the party in the long run. So I think we talk about the fragility of the GNU. I think there are strong, red lights, lots of red lights flashing on the dashboard for MK.
Yeah, I think it's also a reminder of how it's not actually that easy for the ANC to walk away from the GNU and form a coalition with MK or the EFF, or those, they risk suffering significant, cross-contamination from those parties, which have enormous amounts of dysfunction within them, which, they don't, no one seems to have a clear way out of. All right, for our last story, a survey of economists and investors by Bloomberg found that it's very likely that South Africa will have to wait until next year to see a lowering of its inflation target, and that This is after lots of calls for the inflation target to be adjusted by government, but it seems as though the Reserve Bank is remaining relatively conservative. What's your take on this, Chris?
Yeah, I think that mention of the word conservative hits the nail on the head. So around the world, given the sort of latest injection of global investment and trade, uncertainty, the possibility of tariff wars, etc., that just means that possibly inflation globally could take longer to come down to levels that was before COVID, if it does at all. And for a small open economy like South Africa that is more exposed to imported inflation because we've hollowed out our own manufacturing sector, when lots of components and goods prices rise globally, we import that inflation that impacts negatively on us. Part of the inflation target is also for the Reserve Bank to manage expectations in terms of wage negotiations. So maybe at the moment it then gives those, this is in the public and private sector, it gives a bit more leeway for employers and employees to not push down maybe as far as they would have had there been a lower target. At the moment, the Reserve Bank has an inflation target band between 3% to 6%. So the midpoint is 4.5%. And maybe a lower target, a fixed target would be something like 3% or even lower. But for now, given global context, given that South Africa has a bit of positive sentiment, but we haven't really seen growth pick up domestically, I think the Reserve Bank is trying to hold fire. They can also, of course, only do what they are able to with the tools at their disposal. They can fight inflation where they can manage. But if their colleagues in other government departments don't implement the reforms that are in favor of economic growth, it's almost like one government department fighting against another one. So this should be the expectation for the time being, that reserve banks all around the world, central banks, are going to be more cautious. The chairman of the Federal Reserve in the US, Jerome Powell, in the last week indicated similar sentiments, that the Fed is also just going to hold fire for a little bit. Hopefully they still will cut, but just for now. And South Africa and other emerging markets will take their sort of signal from the Fed, because also the Reserve Bank will want to shore up some of the value of the rand, which means if they cut even more aggressively or push down the inflation rate and it's out of sync with the Fed, that is worse for the value of the rand.
Interesting to watch. All right, that's all the time we have for today. We hope that you found the show interesting. Please do subscribe to us on YouTube or on the podcast apps. If you're listening to us on audio only, we really would appreciate that. Please like the video if you liked it, and we will see you tomorrow on The Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone. The Daily Friend Show and The Daily Friend are a project of the Institute of Race Relations, the IRR. The IRR is a think tank which was founded in 1929 to study race relations in South Africa and works to change government policy to improve race relations through non-racialism and to ensure the prosperity of all South Africans. If you like our work and would like to support us, please go to irr.org.za and click Support the IRR. Or you can go to thedailyfriend.co.za and click the Fund Us button.